Thank you for joining us here at Evening at Egan. I am very, very pleased to introduce to you Joel Markis. Growing up in South Central Alaska, Joel was continuously exposed to the outdoors and fisheries. He pursued a growing passion for fisheries by attending Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana, where he honed his skiing and fly fishing skills, but also received a BS in fish and wildlife management. During his senior year at MSU, Joel participated in the National Student Exchange, attending Florida International University in Miami. And while at FIU, Joel studied marine biology and tropical ecology and tied it all together, attaining his master's scuba diver certification. After spending time in the Kenai Fords, Denali, the Tongass, and Wrangell, he decided to pursue a graduate degree in marine biology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Before coming to the UA system, Joel worked for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and then worked as a research fisheries biologist with the Kachemak Bay Research Reserve in Homer. Joel has been with the Fisheries Technology Program since 2013, where he was an outreach coordinator and adjunct faculty member at the Homer campus. Since moving to Sitka in 2014, Joel has worked his way into a tenure track position and now directs the Fisheries Technology Program. He is passionate about teaching and Alaska fisheries. And I want to let everyone know that we are going to have a Mariculture Conference coming up February 22nd to 24th of 2022 in Juneau. And Joel has been instrumental in making that conference come about. To me, Joel is a real star for UAS. His work is unparalleled, and I am just so pleased to listen to his talk tonight. So Joel, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that marvelous introduction, Karen. I greatly appreciate it. When I agreed to do this, it was, I had a slightly different venue in mind. I pictured being in a beautiful library in Juneau, looking out over a beautiful southeast landscape, potentially all, having a glass of wine and sharing ideas and thoughts together. But instead, we're here, I'm in my office. But the takeaway for me is, or at least the trade-off is, by not having that experience, I could potentially be doing this in my underwear right now, and none of you would know any difference. So thank you. I guess I can share my screen right now, and we can get this little party started. All right. And can everyone see the presentation now? Can I get some kind of a confirmation? Maybe even audibly from somebody? Yep, okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So as Karen mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about fisheries, aquaculture, and mariculture in Southeast Alaska tonight, and I'm excited to be here. So I like to try and start with a bit of an outline, and it kind of comes right from my title slide. We're gonna start by talking a little bit about fisheries broadly. We're gonna then kind of talk about aquaculture and what aquaculture is in Alaska. We'll talk a little bit about mariculture, and then about kind of the university's involvement in mariculture and some of our work focused around mariculture workforce development. And I'm happy to take questions at any point along the way. If you guys put them in the chat, I think somebody will hopefully stop me and we can kind of take some questions at that point. So Karen did a great job introducing myself. You guys, kind of know a little bit about my background at this point. And I guess the only thing that I would add to that is that, and I think it's kind of unique, is I started my career as a college student at UAA. I was a dual enrollment student. I took a World Wilderness First Aid class through UAA. I then went out of state, as you heard, and then came back to the university system for graduate school. Then my first teaching gig was through the Homer campus, where I was an adjunct faculty there. And, so went to school, taught at UAA, went to school at UAF, and now teach and run our fisheries program down here out of the Sitka campus. And so it's kind of unique from my perspective that, not only do I work for this institution, but I'm a product of this institution, and I have some I don't know, ties to kind of all of the different campuses, which I don't know, I've got a lot of colleagues around the state, and I'm excited to work for this great institution. So it's fun to be able to talk about fisheries, and the reason that I think it's fun is because fisheries are important. Fisheries are important to Alaska for a number of different reasons. Many of us probably have ties to fisheries for a whole bunch of different reasons. They're important to us as a society. There's a lot of people that make their living, accessing and capturing fish from the ocean and the rivers. Many of us are subsistence users of fisheries resources, and it's a large economic driver for the state. And so I'll hopefully make that case a little bit, and then we can talk a little bit more about fisheries. So I kind of want to start real broadly from a global perspective and talking about fisheries before we hone in on Alaska specifically. And so globally, fisheries are pretty valuable. We harvest kind of on average about 180 million tons of fish globally. That has a value of about $400 billion. And so the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is part of the, not the World Health Organization, one of those large international organizations. I'm drawing a blank on it right now, but they produce these reports kind of on an annual basis that talks about the value of the different fisheries and kind of what some of the trends are. And so it's a great report. It's the status of world fisheries and aquaculture. You can look it up, and it's interesting to look through. And so I'll cite some of the statistics and figures from that report here, but it's a great resource. And so one of the other things is based on those numbers of fisheries captures out of the ocean and fisheries products that are produced, on average, that equals out to about 20 kilograms of fish that are consumed per person globally, which is a huge volume of fish. And 46% of that fish actually comes from aquaculture, or from reared fish in some capacity. And so if we take a look at the first figure that I have from that FAO report, it shows world fisheries production over the last about 70 years or so. And so the couple of things I'll point out, we've got on the y-axis over here on the left-hand side is the number of million tons of fish actually harvested. Years are across the bottom on the x-axis. And in red, we've got capture fisheries for inland waters. The orange slice in the middle here is capture fisheries in marine waters. And then we've got aquaculture, inland aquaculture, which from my perspective is probably largely driven by shrimp fisheries that take place in Mexico and in Indonesia and those parts of the world. And then we've got marine aquaculture, is this light blue color here. And so the things that I think are that jump out at me from this figure are that we really haven't captured wild fish, or we haven't increased our capture in our production of wild fish since about the early 90s or so. So that line has plateaued, and really where we've seen increases globally in fish production is in the aquaculture realm. So that would be these two kind of sectors over here. So if we break this down and look more regionally in fisheries production, we can look, you can see on the top here, we've got China, who is the largest producer of fisheries products. Again, they're kind of broken down into those same color schemes, red being inland fisheries, the orange being wild capture fisheries in the ocean, and then the dark blue being inland aquaculture, and the light blue being aquaculture in marine environments. And so China is the hugest producer by far, and you can see kind of trends over time in the last 10 years, or the last longer than that, about 50 years or so. You can see kind of the trends that they've taken and the ways that they've increased. And you can see down here, the Americas, including us and South America, we're kind of third on this list. If we look at global fisheries production, as far as capture production is concerned, and so this is going out and actually catching fish and bringing those fish to market. The United States actually ranks about 6th on that list globally as far as countries are concerned. And Alaska, if we were identified as a country of our own, we catch so much fish here in Alaska that we would be about 10th on this list. So this next figure looks at how we actually use the fisheries products that we're capturing and where they end up going ultimately. And so you can see, again, we've got a couple of things on the various axes. We've got time across the bottom here, and then we've got the actual utilization, how much of these fisheries we're using in millions of tons on the y-axis, and on the secondary axis is actually the population size. And so the population is this orange bar here that is, continuously increasing over time, and then fisheries utilization is actually the per capita utilization is this red bar here. And so one of the things that's kind of sticks out is not only is it increasing, but it's increasing more than the actual population rate is. So that's we're eating more fish per person than we did 40 or 50 years ago. And you can see the superimposed blue colors in the back are food uses versus non-food uses. This would be things like creating fish meal for fertilizers or fish oils that might be used. And so that would be those categories. So the takeaway when we look at these kind of global fisheries trends are that really we're not able to capture more wild fish. There's no more wild fish in the ocean that we can go out and capture. We've been plateaued for the last 20 or 30 years now. We have increased food needs because there's more people on the planet. We like eating fisheries resources, and so we're eating more of those things. There's a growing demand for those things as well. And aquaculture is increasing globally around the world, essentially, and that there's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of money in these fisheries and fisheries resources. So if you're interested in that report, if you just search FAO, SOFA, you can find this report, and they do a pretty good job of summarizing a bunch of that information and other information associated with fisheries and aquaculture. So now what I'd like to do is look a little bit more specifically at Alaska in general and tell you why Alaska and fisheries are important. And really, we're kind of primarily looking at the economic sector and how that drives the economy. And so in Alaska, fisheries are responsible for almost 60,000 jobs across the state. If we average that out to full-time employment, it's about 40,000 jobs. It creates $5.6 billion in economic activity. 2.1 of that is in actual wages, where people in the fishing industry are getting paid. And about $172 million are created in taxes. And so the state actually gets that money, and it helps fund things like the university and schools and roads and all of that. In Alaska, actually, we capture about 2/3 of the seafood that is harvested in the US. And here in Alaska, we have 9 out of the 20 top fishing ports nationwide. And so this information comes from a great report that is put together by the Alaska Fisheries Seafood Marketing Institute. They partner with the McDowell Group. If you search value of Alaska seafood, they have some great figures. I'm going to cite a few more of them here for you. But about every year, they produce one of these reports, and it helps people go to legislature and argue that fisheries are important. It helps me tell you guys how fisheries are important, and it's used for a lot of different things. So fisheries as an economic sector in Alaska is really only second to oil and gas. I mean, it's a pretty distant second, but still it's only second to oil and gas. And it kind of, it flip-flops back and forth with the visitor industry. Obviously, we've been hit pretty hard in the last couple of years in the visitor sector, but it's a very large sector in the state as far as an economic driver is concerned. We can see that the number of jobs created kind of by region, and in Southeast, about 8,000 of our jobs here in Southeast Alaska are related to the fisheries sector. So if we look specifically at commercial fishing, there's about 30,000 commercial fishing jobs each year in Alaska. It creates about $1 billion in wages. If we average that out, it's about $34,000 per year. Obviously, that varies widely. A deckhand makes a lot less money than somebody who owns a boat and has their own permits and things. And in Alaska, we've got about 9,000 commercial fishing vessels. If we stack those end to end, that basically row of fishing boats would reach 65 miles long if they were stacked end to end. So that just kind of puts in perspective the scale of the fishing sector in Alaska. So seafood processing is also part of the fisheries industry. Seafood processing employs about 26,000 workers. They make $435 million in wages. It averages out to about $16,000 per person. Obviously, there's some differences in salaries there as well. And the seafood processing industry is comprised of about 166 shore-based plants. There's about 50 catcher processor vessels and 10 large floating processors. And the figure on the bottom right here, you can see from that same report, it kind of outlines some of the different products that are created from our seafood in Alaska. And so 41% of it is just headed and gutted and whole fish. Another 13% end up in surimi. That's kind of like the fake crab. About 20% end up in fillets. And then we've got roe, canned, meal oil, and other as well. So fisheries management kind of rounds out the fisheries industry sector. There's a lot fewer jobs in fisheries management and or research. They make a decent amount of money per year, and that's things like state and federal agencies, the Department of Fish and Game, NOAA, the university researchers and faculty are probably included in that list as well. But that's kind of the other sector in Alaska. And so as a whole, this kind of just looks at the fishery sector in Alaska. You can see the number of jobs, the labor income that it creates, and the money that actually comes into the state from the fisheries sector. So now if we kind of hone in specifically on Southeast Alaska, well, what does this actually mean for Southeast Alaska? The fisheries industry is the largest private sector employer in Southeast Alaska based on workforce size and labor income. Seafood accounts for about 15, or seafood related jobs account for about 15% of the employment here in Southeast Alaska. And our residents own about a quarter of the commercial fishing fleet in Alaska. And so a quarter of those boats are retained and owned by residents of Southeast Alaska. Southeast Alaska also includes 4 of the top 10 communities ranked by resident permit holder and their gross earnings. Petersburg being the third in the state with $45 million in gross earnings. Sitka is 4th, Ketchikan is 8th, and Juneau is 9th. And obviously fishing is important in Southeast Alaska, and we have a number of people that choose to live here and choose to make fishing a part of their livelihood. So what does that fishing actually look like? Where is that revenue coming from ultimately? It's about 50-50 split between harvesting jobs and seafood processing jobs. 60% of the fisheries resources that are captured in Alaska are salmon. And in Southeast Alaska, we have 4 hatchery associations and 15 hatcheries that help support those salmon fisheries. And the figure on the right here, you can see kind of the breakdown of the fisheries resources that dominate Southeast Alaska. Halibut being about 33%. This is keta or chum salmon is about 30% of the catch. Other salmon species is 17%, and then we have pink salmon at 11% and other resources. So trends in the seafood industry, they kind of try and track these things over time. And you can see if we look at the number of resident commercial fishermen, it seems like that number peaked in about 2014, and it has declined until the data ends at this point in 2018. But earnings has kind of gone up and gone down a little bit, as well as the first wholesale value of the fisheries over time. And so I think the fishing industry is fairly robust in Southeast Alaska, and my prediction, given strong returns, is that it will remain a robust industry in the region. So the takeaways as far as the Southeast Alaska and fisheries are concerned, we employ in Alaska about 60,000 workers annually. There's a large economic value there, and it's important to Southeast Alaska ultimately. So now what I want to do is go over just kind of a brief history lesson. And the caveat is that I'm not a historian. This is the history as I recollect it and as I think it's pertinent to fisheries. And so it will be somewhat abbreviated, but it's kind of a fun exercise. And I think it's something that not everybody is aware of with respect to kind of our state's history. And so one of the first things I want to do is I break down, kind of history into different timetables. And so the first thing that I would mention is just that, indigenous peoples have occupied this land for thousands of years before anybody was commercially capturing fish, and we're great stewards of this land. And so I think, I'm trying to recognize that that initially as kind of an initial time frame. There was then a Russian occupation era, then there was a territorial Alaska era, and then we ended up with statehood, and then we kind of are in this post-statehood vein now. So in the Russian era, we had kind of minor commercialization of salmon resources. It was a subsistence resource for European traders and explorers. There was some barter for salmon on the Fraser and Columbia River, and there started to be an export trade for salmon, salted salmon out of Sitka and Kodiak. But really, unlike a lot of the other resources in that time frame, things like fur seals that had robust management, there was no management of salmon ultimately. So we entered this territorial Alaska timeline. They discovered gold in California. There was population expansion. Salmon became an important food source. We had a first cannery in the Sacramento River in 1958. The Columbia River followed. And then in 1867, Alaska was purchased from Russia. It was seen as a terrible investment. And we saw Southeast canneries start to take place in the late 1870s and shortly thereafter in Cook Inlet and Kodiak. So in that kind of territorial time frame, there was this large the federalism that gave a lot of the power to regulating the fisheries to the feds, and Alaska was largely ignored. There was a bunch of laws that took place kind of in that territorial Alaska time frame that limited self-governance. They appointed a territorial governor. They established this fish commission to study the fisheries in Alaska. They basically said that they were unregulated. There was lots of dams and barriers that impeded fish travel, and they predicted the collapse of fisheries. So the kind of next thing that happened was there was a lot of legislations to try and restrict the fishing efforts. They established the first hatcheries in the state. They were kind of connected to a lot of the canneries that were in existence. The canneries grew. They got a lot of influence in DC and in Washington. They tried to pass a lot of bills to manage and regulate fisheries, but a lot of those failed just due to the lobbyists in DC that had control of the canneries. And we saw fish traps expand from about 60 in 1906 to about 800, not only about 15 years later. And fish traps were very unpopular in the territorial AK region. And so if you're not familiar with what a fish trap is, this is a fish trap. Essentially, a fish swims in, they get lost inside the various veins of the trap, and they can't find their way back out. It's an extremely effective way to capture fish, especially if you block off an entire river, like you can see over here on the left panel. So fish traps are a great way to catch fish. You don't have to handle the fish very often, and you don't hurt them. It creates a great superior fisheries product. Canneries loved them, but all the locals didn't like them. So they placed them in these really productive locations. They were efficient. There's no labor necessary. The canneries owned all the fishing rights around the traps, and they liked the cannery owners really liked using fish traps because they were efficient. So about that time frame, salmon, herring, halibut, all these things declined prior to statehood. Only 38 of about 400 and some odd salmon traps in Alaska were owned by Alaskans. And so there was no real self-rule of our fisheries or fisheries management. Lower 48 had control over the canneries through federal management. And this was one of the big things that pushed the populace of Alaska towards statehood. It was seen as the public enemy number one were these fish traps. So we developed a constitution, 1950 or 55 and 56. All these delegates got together. They developed this constitution. It was ratified by the voters in 56, became law in 59 with statehood. And this was an actual ballot. On the ballot was, do you want to abolish fish traps? Oh yeah. Do you want to adopt a constitution and potentially become a state? And that's how, that's one of the reasons, large reasons that Alaska became a state. And one kind of small fact is there's only one place now that fish traps are a legal gear type, and that's on Annette Island, but they haven't been used for a number of years. And so this was the fish trap vote. This is what it was seen. We're going to bring people out to abolish fish traps, and we want to become a state also. So a lot of people have seen these figures or these pictures. Eisenhower signed Statehood Act in 58. We became a state in 59 with Juneau as the capital, and William Egan was the first governor. And so, you know, given where we should be right now in the Egan Library, I thought it was pretty relevant to at least provide a brief quote from William Egan that I think, you know, is extremely relevant. And so he said, on January 1st of this year, Alaska Department of Fish and Game was handed the depleted remnants of what was once a rich and prolific fishery. From a peak of 750 million pounds in 1936 of salmon production, it dropped then in 1959 to its lowest in 60 years. On these ruins of a once great resource, the department has to rebuild. Our gain is that we can profit by studying the destructive practices, mistakes, and omissions of the past. The revival of the commercial fisheries is an absolute imperative. The livelihood of thousands of fishermen and the very existence of many communities scattered along thousands of miles of coastline depends upon improvement of the fisheries. To this end, we give our best efforts. And so that's a great quote for me as, you know, a fisheries professional and been involved in fisheries management. And I think, you know, it's a great way as we think about our past fisheries management, our current fisheries management, and the places that we're looking to go in the future. I think it has great relevance. So now, after our brief history lesson, I'm going to talk a little bit about aquaculture and aquaculture in Alaska. So aquaculture is essentially, in the most broad terms, it's breeding, rearing, or harvesting of fish, shellfish, algae, or other organisms in all different types of water and environments. And so this could be freshwater or saltwater. This could be clams, crabs, shrimp, salmon, seaweed, all kinds of different things. Aquaculture is this very broad term that covers all types of rearing of aquatic organisms, essentially. And so before we move on and talk a little bit further about aquaculture and some other things, I want to kind of identify a couple of other common terms, just so everybody is familiar with them in the way that I'll be using them. So aquaculture, we just mentioned. Farming or agriculture really is cultivating of plants and or livestock for food. And we could see that or view that as cultivating organisms that we are going to then eat for food. A hatchery is a facility where eggs are hatched under artificial conditions. And so we hatch things in a hatchery. That makes sense. And a nursery is a place where young plants or trees are raised. This is from a plant context. If we were thinking about other organisms, an oyster nursery would be a place where young oysters are raised. And so I think those are just kind of important terms as we move forward. So another thing that I want to point out is that fish farming, fin fish farming in Alaska is illegal. It's prohibited by Alaska statute. The practices that take place in Norway and in British Columbia do not happen in Alaska, and it is illegal to farm raise fish to their full adult size and then sell them for food or eat them for food, essentially. And so fish farming in Alaska is illegal. So there are a number of benefits from aquaculture. Aquaculture can produce seafood for human consumption. It enhances wild fish and shellfish. It can restore habitats in clean water, restore threatened and endangered aquatic species potentially, provide nutritional and industrial compounds potentially, and or provide fish for aquariums and or things like pearls and ornamental things of that nature. And so that kind of is aquaculture in its most broad sense. In Alaska, oftentimes when people talk about aquaculture, what they're actually talking about is our salmon enhancement programs that take place throughout the state. And these salmon enhancement programs can be a variety of things, but essentially it's any project that enhances current healthy wild stocks. And this can be hatchery production, this can be lake fertilization, it can be planting fish in lakes, or other things as well. And so one example is a stream restoration project where folks go out, they fix habitat that has been degraded or blocked, and it provides access for adult salmon to come back to and spawn, and it provides better habitat for the juveniles. And so that's enhancing that fishery. Another thing that we do here in Southeast Alaska is we fertilize some lakes that typically don't have a lot of fertilizer or a lot of nutrients in them. This nutrients then stimulates phytoplankton growth. Juvenile salmon eat on the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, which eat the phytoplankton, and this can help those juvenile salmon populations before they outmigrate to sea and get to become large adult salmon. So salmon enhancement has kind of a long history in Alaska. In '59, we had our history lesson. Alaska became a state. In 1971, shortly thereafter, the state developed this Fisheries Rehabilitation and Enhancement Division, or the FRED division of the Department of Fish and Game. In 1974, we established this hatchery program where there were private nonprofit hatcheries, and they were allowed to get permits. And in 1988, all the state hatcheries were contracted to the private nonprofit hatcheries that were operating those hatcheries. And so why did we start a salmon enhancement program in Alaska? Well, the reason is that, as I mentioned before, statehood, we saw salmon stocks decline fairly heavily up until statehood. And then even thereafter, the salmon stocks were low in the state. And so on the y-axis here, we have the commercial harvest in number of fish, of salmon, and then we have the time frame on the x-axis. And so you can see, here's 1959 in statehood. Salmon harvest was at a relatively low, almost complete low. And then over time, the salmon harvest did not increase adequately, and we established basically this hatchery program in the state of Alaska. And so you can see that hatchery program is the contribution to the wild harvest is in dark blue here. You can see that the hatchery program has extremely well complemented the wild harvest that takes place in Alaska, and we've seen our salmon returns at record levels in as recent as the past decade. So what species of salmon are raised and released in Alaska? Well, we have salmon hatcheries that release all 5 species of salmon, but it's primarily our pink salmon and our chum salmon. And this is really because it's most cost effective to release those. They only require 1 year in freshwater versus some of the other species that require 2 and/or 3 years in freshwater. And so we only have to get them through kind of the first portion of their life stage before we can release them into the wild. And you can see that as recently as 2018, we released over 1.8 billion juvenile fish into the North Pacific. And so that is a ton of juvenile fish that we released into the North Pacific. So the salmon hatchery program in Alaska that has supplemented our wild fisheries. Currently, there's 33 hatcheries operating in the state. We have 19 of those here in Southeast Alaska. These programs are operated and funded by the state of Alaska, and there's kind of 2 categories. There's these not-profit regional aquaculture associations, and then there's kind of these smaller kind of one-off aquaculture associations. And basically in the 70s, the state said that they wanted these aquaculture associations to kind of take over this. And the idea was that they were going to put the burden of operating and running these hatcheries on the commercial fishermen, because they were the primary beneficiaries of these hatchery returns. And so they were the primary user group benefiting from those things. So regional aquaculture associations around the state, we've got, 5 of them: Cook Inlet Regional Aquaculture Association, Prince William Sound, Kodiak, Northern Southeast Regional, and Southern Southeast Regional Aquaculture Association. And generally, all of these associations have multiple projects. They have multiple hatcheries that they operate, multiple release sites, and that hopefully, kind of diversifies the types of things that they're doing. But these hatcheries associations are also allowed to actually levy a tax on the commercial fishermen to help offset the costs that they have of operating their hatcheries. And so it's kind of a unique situation there. And they also have a presence on the kind of the planning group that the Department of Fish and Game has, where they get together and talk about fisheries issues. So in Southeast Alaska, there are 17 hatcheries associated with those hatchery associations, and this is kind of the list of those. You can see them scattered all throughout Southeast Alaska. And then we've got kind of these other hatchery associations. They don't receive funding through a similar assessment tax. They get their money through cost recovery, where they actually catch fish and then sell those fish to help support the operations that they run. And there are organizations like VFDA, DIPAC there in Juneau that a lot of you guys know about, Cake Tribal, Armstrong Kita, Metlakatla, Sitka Sound Science Center, and the Prince of Wales Hatchery Association as well. So in Alaska, hatcheries, as I mentioned, are extremely important. We released about 1.8 billion juvenile fish in the state, at a peak. A quarter of the value of the salmon that are harvested in the state of Alaska come from hatchery production. It's about 22 million pounds on average and about $120 million over time. So I think, maybe I'll just jump back real quick and say that, the current salmon enhancement and hatchery program in Alaska is important. Aquaculture, as we've described thus far in Alaska, is an important economic driver, and it supplements the wild capture of fisheries resources that takes place in the state. So now what I'd like to do is kind of take a quick peek at global aquaculture and what is happening around the world. And so, kind of similar to some of the trends that we've seen before, if we look at global aquaculture production in a variety of different categories, whether it's aquatic algae, crustaceans, finfish, mollusks, you can see that it's increasing. It's increasing over time by fairly substantially. If we look at numbers in the 1990s, we're somewhere in the magnitude of 4 times larger. We're producing 4 times more things globally, more aquaculture resources. And so this figure is from that same FAO report. And what it does is it looks at the global fish captures, and it superimposes on top of their aquaculture production and the percentage of that production that is made up of aquaculture. And so you can see over time, aquaculture are these blue bars here. The wild capture fisheries are the orange bars. And as I mentioned before, these are kind of remaining level over time. Aquaculture is increasing and ramping up over time. And you can see the contribution that aquaculture makes to that larger fisheries production increases globally up to, most recently about 45% of global production is through aquaculture. If we look at us here in the Americas, this includes South America as well, but you can see wild capture fisheries are fairly high and aquaculture production is fairly low, but also ramping up. And that percentage remains a lot lower than kind of the global average, though. We're up in the 17 to maybe 18% of our fisheries production comes from aquaculture in the Americas. And so just kind of for further reference, I want to toss out the figure that is China specific. They absolutely lead the world, and I'm not saying that it's in a good way, but they produce more aquaculture resources than anybody else on the planet. And we can see that they produce somewhere in the magnitude of 75% of their fisheries resources come from aquaculture and aquaculture production. So now what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about aquaculture. Well, we've talked a little bit about aquaculture, but I'm going to kind of identify and define what is mariculture and how does it fit into this aquaculture piece. And so mariculture is essentially the cultivation of fish or marine organisms for food. And so mariculture is specifically focused on marine environments, and whereas aquaculture can be anything in freshwater and marine environments, and kind of encompasses mariculture. And so if we think about, kind of where we're headed, as a planet and as a state, if we look at kind of the global fisheries stocks, the FAO monitors about 600 of those fisheries stocks. And over time, those stocks have gone from, either underfished or healthy to completely fished and or even overfished at a pretty alarming rate. And so we've only got 3% of our fisheries stocks are underexploited. Some 20% are moderately exploited, and 52 are fully exploited, and 17% are overexploited. And so there's only there's a very small percentage of fisheries stocks that are out there that we can go access and readily, kind of add to the fisheries production that we are currently producing. And so, ultimately, what is driving a need or a desire to increase aquaculture? And so, I feel like I've made the case now that, our capture fisheries are basically plateaued out. We're maxed out. The only increased capacity that we have is in this aquaculture realm. The world population growth is going to continue. It is projected to increase by billions of people over the next decades. And those people need food. Those people are going to need protein in order to to sustain themselves. So another driving force kind of pushing this aquaculture and mariculture trajectory is climate change. And so it's forecasted in the next 30 years or so, 30 to 50 years, that we may see increases in temperature globally in as much as 4 degrees centigrade. And so those would be massive changes in temperature. And with those changes in temperature, a lot of the places that we currently are growing food may not necessarily be suitable for continuing to grow crops there. And as those latitudes increase, or as we need to move our food production to higher latitudes, those latitudes may not support the current production that we have. If we think about developing agriculture land here in Southeast Alaska, most of us know that we have really shallow soil, and it's not a great place to readily grow agriculture in a terrestrial environment. And so those are some of the additional things that are kind of important when thinking about how can we and how may we increase aquaculture production. So there's a lot of benefits of mariculture and aquaculture for that matter. And so we can take the pressure off of wild species potentially. Some of these organisms have the potential to mitigate pollution. They can filter out and or absorb some of the pollutants that may be released from other activities or practices. Different types of mariculture or aquaculture can provide refuge for fish and invertebrates that might be living in those environments. We can potentially reduce local climate change impacts by offsetting some of the carbon associated with the activities that we do. And we can create jobs in this industry. This is an emerging industry that people can get employment in. But all of that is if it's done correctly. If we mess things up, then all bets are kind of out the window. So I'd like to talk about a couple of different mariculture products. First, we're going to do kind of a little introduction to shellfish and what it is what it means when we raise shellfish. And so shellfish, broadly are organisms that have shells. Typically, they're bivalves, but kind of for the purposes of talking about mariculture, we're going to include a couple other organisms into that category. And so when most people think about mariculture and shellfish, they think about oysters. We have oysters and mussels, gooey duck clams. Shrimp are also a product that can be reared in mariculture. Sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and crabs are all, seafood products that can readily be raised in mariculture and eaten for human consumption. So what's the history of shellfish harvesting? Well, when the tide is out, the table is set. Many people have heard that analogy or acronym. A lot of us have enjoyed razor clams, other types of clams, including butter clams and some other ones that I'm trying to blank on right now: mussels, crabs, limpets, rock jingles, urchins. And so there's a lot of shellfish that is available when the tide is out, essentially. And so what types of shellfish are currently being harvested or currently being farmed in Alaska? And so the three kind of primary ones are blue oysters, blue mussels, and gooey ducks. But hands down, by far, the biggest commercially produced shellfish in Alaska are Pacific oysters. There's some other species, things like little neck clams, cockles, scallops, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers that can be produced in Alaska, are permitted to be produced, but any production that is taking place is on an extremely small scale. So Pacific oysters, these come from Japan. A couple of interesting kind of things about Pacific oysters: they're extremely hardy. They grow fairly rapidly, but they need warmer water ultimately to reproduce. And so because our water is colder than 16 degrees Celsius here in Alaska, they actually grow slower and they don't develop the reproductive tissues that are kind of seen as not desirable for the food consumption market. And so Alaska makes a great place to grow these Pacific oysters, and they do well, and it's a great mariculture product that is currently being produced in Alaska. So where are we actually growing oysters? We've got about 60 farms scattered all throughout the state. We've got a number in Southeast Alaska, a number in South Central and on Kodiak. There are two primary hatcheries that are producing the seeded oysters for the farmers. Those are located in Ketchimack Bay at their Shellfish Cooperative in Homer, and then Blue Star Farm on Prince of Wales Island also. So where are they sold? Well, you can get oysters at local restaurants, farmers markets, grocery stores, seafood distributors, on cruise ships. And they've actually, a lot of these organizations have really increased their capacity in online retail sales kind of around COVID as well. And a lot of the oysters are even shipped out of state. And kind of on average, oyster farmers get between $8 and $18 a dozen for the oysters that they produce. And they take about 4 years to come to full age and full production. So now I want to talk a little bit about seaweed and kelp mariculture and kind of how that works. So what is seaweed? Well, essentially seaweed is kind of a common name for a bunch of different species of marine plants and organisms that and algae ultimately. Algae is a really diverse group of photosynthetic organisms, aquatic organisms. And macroalgae are fixed plants such as bull kelp or giant kelp that are attached to the bottom. And ultimately, these organisms produce organic matter through photosynthesis. So kelp or seaweed are they're primary producers. And so they create organic matter through photosynthesis. They use carbon dioxide, they take in carbon dioxide, they use water and the energy from the sun through photosynthesis to create glucose, the tissues that they're growing, and a byproduct of oxygen. And so one of the unique things about kelp and seaweed is that it does have the capacity to take up CO2, to take up carbon dioxide out of the water, and then thereby the water has more capacity to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so it is one of those emerging markets that people are looking in as far as how might we offset some of the carbon that we are putting out into the atmosphere. So there are a number of different traditional uses that rise from seaweed farming. Seaweed is first farmed in Japan way back when. China established some of the first farms for sugar kelp or saccharina in the 1950s. In the 1960s, wild harvest became limited due to kind of depleted stocks. And there was this increased demand across the markets for a farm-raised kelp products. And in 2009, the first commercially viable seaweed farm was established in Maine. And so it's a relatively new industry, ultimately, at the end of the day. And there's a lot of traditional uses for seaweed. Everything from fishing lines to nets, ropes, harpoon lines, even anchor lines are used from these products. You can see this is a bull kelp stipe here. That's the big gas-filled pneumaticist at the top that is created. Those are really, anybody that's played with those knows that they're extremely strong. As kids, we used to pick them up and flip them around like whips. But they have a lot of traditional uses. So they're used for food in a number of different ways, including they use macrocystis and fucus, which are both types of kelp or seaweed, are deployed in herring eggs are collected on those. We can make pickles out of them, and they even make kind of these shrunken heads out of the bull kelp pneumaticysts. So there's a number of different types of seaweed that are permitted to grow in Alaska. There's really only 3 primary ones that are actively being grown: bull kelp, Nereocystis, ribbon kelp, Alaria, and sugar kelp, saccharina. But all these others are additionally permitted, and there could be capacity depending on kind of how sea kelp and kelp farmers progress. So this is bull kelp. This is what bull kelp looks like. This is kind of the family and the order. This is actually some of the reproductive tissue down here that you can see. We use bull kelp for a lot of different things, including adding it to sea kelp. It's the primary component in the barnacle kelp salsa. They make hot sauce out of it. Ribbon kelp or Alaria, you can see pictured here. They make a lot of different things out of it. Blue Evolution makes kind of these dried seaweed or dried kelp kind of tasty treats. We can also make seaweed salad out of this. And then sugar kelp or saccharina, we can see pictured here. And a lot of the uses for sugar kelp or saccharina are kind of more for the compounds that it creates rather than the food products, but they do make food out of it as well. And so there's a number of different things that seaweed that is in the products that we eat and or use every day that have seaweed and products in them. These are everyday things such as toothpaste and ice cream and whipping cream. And so seaweed is kind of an important product, and will continue to be an important product as this industry evolves and develops in Alaska. So now I'd just like to talk a little bit about what is kind of necessary in Alaska to move this mariculture industry forward. The previous governor developed a mariculture task force. That mariculture task force has worked with industry and the university and a lot of different people over the years to develop some priorities. Some of those priorities and challenges are kind of listed here below. That task force has now submitted a final report to the governor and developed the Alaska Mariculture Alliance. The University of Alaska Southeast is one of the founding members of that Mariculture Alliance, and a partner of it, and will continue to kind of stay engaged in mariculture activities. And so some of the challenges are the application process needs streamlining. There needs to be more tribal input incorporated into the application process, and that needs to take place early on. They need more mapping tools to allow people to better choose sites and better see where various mariculture farms are located currently. The potential to have pre-approved sites would be great. So somebody could say, this is a list of the pre-approved sites, just pick one and start farming. And there needs to be more training opportunities so people can learn about how to develop these things, and we can grow the workforce. And there needs to be improved sales and marketing of the products that we're ultimately creating. So the university is involved fairly extensively in mariculture and the mariculture industry. This is an emerging industry in fishery. There's lots of excitement around it right now. It's multifaceted, however, or as well. And the university, being a large organization, has a lot of different kind of roles to play in that arena. One of which is research. The College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences at UAF, that has a large graduate school. They have a lot of people doing research, as well as we have had here at UAS. Outreach is an important component of mariculture. The Alaska Sea Grant does a really good job of outreaching and providing training courses to folks. And there's a need to develop a workforce as well. And our fisheries program is working on that to try and develop a mariculture workforce. So Karen mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the Mariculture Conference that is coming up in Juneau, February 22nd through the 24th. She's been a really instrumental player in helping develop that conference. The university is the lead organization in this, and the goal of the conference is to support continued development of mariculture in Alaska through consideration of accomplishments and opportunities in the area of research and education, policy and regulation, and industry growth. And then we kind of have the conference is laid out in 3 days. There's an industry day focused on industry engagement and folks currently in the industry. There's a governmental piece focused on permitting and the governmental process. And then there's a day where we're going to talk about the research that's currently happening, gaps in it, and what educational opportunities there are and how we can further develop those. And so the last thing I'd like to do while I have your guys' attention is kind of talk a little bit about our applied fisheries program and how we're engaging in kind of this mariculture industry and mariculture sector. And so our fisheries program is a 1 and 2 year applied program. It focuses on workforce development. We want to get students a skill set and training so that they can go into the job market. And so we kind of focus on fisheries management, aquaculture, and mariculture, and then we do some scientific diving as well. And we have 1 and 2 year degrees ultimately. And so this is applied fisheries education, get skills, training, and an education that can get you a job. And so one of the big things that I want to talk about is something that is currently taking place. We are currently a little over halfway through our inaugural Alaska Aquaculture semester. This is where we brought students from all over basically here to Sitka to participate in a semester intensive focused on aquaculture and aquaculture in Alaska. And so this is both salmon aquaculture as well as mariculture, learning about how to raise things like seaweed and shellfish. And this is the current cohort of students in the aquaculture semester. And these slides are hot off the press. They just got back from a tour of Southeast Alaska looking at a variety of different hatcheries and shellfish farms and seaweed farms here around Southeast Alaska. And it was a hugely successful trip for the students and a lot of our industry partners that we have partnered with to provide these educational opportunities for our students. And so these are just some pictures of them in some of these various different facilities, learning kind of hands-on how these aquaculture and mariculture operations work and learning the skills necessary to enter this workforce. So you can see here, this is, I believe, helping Northern Southeast Regional Aquaculture Association up at Salmon Lake. These are some juvenile salmon here. These are working on some sort of a weir. I'm not even sure where this weir is because Angie sends me pictures of all the great things our students are doing. This is a shellfish hatchery in Southeast Alaska. You can see these baskets of oysters here. We've got students holding up oysters, pulling up lantern nets full of oysters. Learning from some of our industry partners about that shellfish process. These are juvenile oysters. This is preparing some of the seeded lines that we're creating as a part of our training kelp farm that we have here in Sitka. And so not only do these students learn all about how to do these things associated with aquaculture and mariculture, but we want them to have a well-rounded background in boating and marine safety. So we offer a boating class to them, an outboard maintenance class to them, and then we partner with the Alaskan Marine Safety Education Association to provide some cold water survival training also, because dealing with fisheries in Alaska, you're going to be in and around the water, and being proficient in these things is really important for these students. So we can see these are a couple more pictures from their just recent trip down into further Southeast Alaska. They were over in Prince of Wales and Craig, I believe, and Ketchikan, and touring some of these various facilities. And so this is a slide just thanking some of those partners that welcomed our students into their facilities and helped us teach and train and show them all the various different aspects of what they do so that they can hopefully become the future generations of shellfish, seaweed, and hatchery operators and farmers. And so, kind of our plans as an applied fisheries program are to further develop the teaching farm that we currently have. The students just today, we're seeding lines. We basically have spawned seaweed, and now we have these lines are getting ready to have the juvenile seaweed spores attached to them so that we can then stretch them out in the ocean and they can grow into full-grown kelp. They just did that today. And so we're going to further develop that teaching farm and hopefully start to include other species, things like the shellfish that would be additionally important to train the students on. We're in the process of finalizing an occupational endorsement that we've run through the curriculum committee at this point. They're reviewing that college credential. This will be focused specifically on mariculture to provide students training in mariculture. And additionally, our plans are to secure some additional soft money to support a full-time mariculture faculty position. There's a number of different ways that we're working on that currently. And then kind of the last goal for us is we will be applying for a farm permit this early spring, where the plan is to turn the current teaching farm that we have into an actual working farm, where we would be able to actually not only train students, but then also commercially sell some of the seafood products that those students are helping create to commercial markets on a limited scale. And so I look forward to the opportunity to share all of those with you. The next time I give one of these presentations, hopefully we can dine on delicious mariculture products that are created by our students while they learn. And so I think I am just about right on time, which is a miracle of some feat for sure.
Perfect, Joel. Wonderful. Does anyone have any questions?
I do, Karen. This is Marin. Joel, whereabouts in Sitka is the teaching farm?
So right now we've partnered with, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the organization, but it's essentially north of town, and gosh, I'm losing it. I'm sorry, Marin, but the bay is
It's a long week.
It has been.
It has been a long week. The bay's name I'm drawing a blank of right now, but
Is it up near like Catlian Bay?
No, it's further out into kind of Sitka Sound a little bit, but
Okay.
yeah, it is up kind of in that neck of the woods. And the farm site that we're hoping to get permitted, it will be south of town across Eastern Channel, essentially out kind of in that neck of the woods.
Okay, go ahead.
How do you deal with paralytic shellfish poisoning that has been a big problem in some of where natives in Sitka have historically gotten
Well, and
shellfish?
it kind of it depends on the species, but currently folks that raise oysters, the Department of Environmental Conservation regulates the shellfish that they produce, and there's a couple of different testing programs that they utilize to make sure that the shellfish that are sold commercially are safe and viable. Gooey ducks, for instance, which are a large clam that are both raised in mariculture form and harvested wild as well. Those they actually sample those. They sample a subset of the organisms that they've collected, and as long as they clear and come up negative for paralytic shellfish poisoning, then they can bring those to a commercial market.
But I guess I'm wondering, do you study the factors like ocean warming and all that lead to the shellfish poisoning?
There's a lot of work that's been done, and even the tribe here in Sitka is actually, I would say, a key player and even a specialist in studying and researching paralytic shellfish poisoning. They've got Southeast Alaska Tribal Ocean Research, CTOR is the acronym, that operates a shellfish testing lab actually for their tribal citizens and everyone else also. And they actually produce warnings from time to time on some of the beaches located here in Southeast Alaska if they detect levels above a certain threshold that might be hazardous to people or human health.
Other questions?
Angie Bowers sent the chat asking, we have grown kelp in cooperation with NSRAA in Deep Inlet and in Crescent Bay with SSSC for research in IMTA and as a teaching tool for our students. And I hope you got all those acronyms.
I do. Angie is our faculty, our mariculture specialist currently, and she is the one primarily that is doing these teachings and these growing of these species. And so, yes, we've worked with Northern Southeast Regional Aquaculture Association in Deep Inlet, and she was talking about in conjunction with integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, which the premise there is that when we rear large concentrations of juvenile fish in net pens before we release them into the wild, there are some negative impacts associated with just having fish close together. They release waste, and that waste is in an area and it's kind of confined to that area. And so if we rear seaweed around those things, that there's the potential to offset some of those negative impacts to a region. And they call that integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, because there's different trophic levels. We've got primary producers and fish which are further up in that trophic level.
Joel, you probably addressed this, and it's probably a stupid question, and you can tell me if it is, but what happens when ships are going over these mariculture farms?
And so, for instance, and actually I can unshare my screen so that we don't all have to look at this picture in these small boxes. But for instance, in the picture that you see above here, and I think this is one of the real, considerations in planning where we put mariculture operations and how we implement the farms. And there's different types of equipment and gear that they can use. They can string the nets, from buoys, with a sunken line in between so that boats can drive in between them. They can kind of, cordon off an area and hopefully develop these farms in locations where there wouldn't be a lot of boat travel or a lot of boat traffic to try and mitigate those things. But those are some of the challenges in finding locations that are suitable for these different mariculture operations.
Yeah, I keep wondering about the cruise ships coming, and we really want to grow mariculture here. And how do we protect?
I think when we think about where the cruise ships go, you know, a cruise ship needs a really deep draft. They need 60, 70, 80 feet of water, you know, otherwise those captains start to get really nervous. And so a lot of this stuff is going to be kind of off on the periphery outside of those. You know, we would never, nobody would try and permit a mariculture farm in the middle of a large shipping channel or a large thoroughfare or anything along those lines. And so it is one of the really important pieces, is that permitting piece on where are we going to put it, who might be impacted by the location, and how might they be impacted, and what other user groups would be using those areas or those environments.
Great. Can you just speak a little bit to your, I know that we haven't been doing it because of COVID, but can you talk a little bit about your scuba semester? Because I know that's a real passion of yours.
It is. It's taking place this next semester. So in January, we'll be bringing 16 students, some local. We have a couple local students here in Alaska, and then students from all over the country to Sitka in order to learn how to become research science divers. And so we take them everything from, I know how to swim, but I don't know anything else, all the way up to, you know, learning how to use tools underwater to look at things like, you know, how many critters or organisms are there? How are these organisms being impacted by things, deploying scientific instrumentation. And it's a lot of work, but it's also really fun. You see the excitement that the students have. And the same is true for the aquaculture semester. When Angie got back from her trip with all the students, I saw all the students, and they were giddy with excitement from being on this trip and seeing all these things kind of in person and learning in this kind of, I don't know, unique and hands-on way.
Great.
So I agree. They did look giddy, and it made me want to be an aquaculture student. So with those students that came and that are studying this semester, Joel, are they typically at another institution, or is this something that is of interest to them, so they've just signed up for the program for this semester?
I think when we looked at the demographics, a couple of them were postgraduates, and so this would be you know, the aquaculture semester results in occupational endorsements. It's a one semester credential, and a couple of them were postgraduate. A couple of them were fresh out of high school, and the rest was kind of somewhere in between, where they had a home institution. I think one student was transitioning between one institution and maybe into another, and I would say over half of them are trying to stay here in Alaska in some way, shape, or form, and would gladly take jobs if offered. And so that's the next piece, is the job fair sort of at the end of the semester with all these different organizations that say, this is what we're looking to hire. Do you want to stay? And I know some of their answers already.
Great. That's awesome. Thanks.
Any other questions for tonight? Well, Joel, thank you so much. I found this fascinating. As you know, I'm learning every day about mariculture with our conference coming up. So this helps me a lot, and I think it helped everybody online. So thank you all. Have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to our conference, Joel, and hearing more from you.
Great. Thanks, guys. It was a fun opportunity.
Thanks, Joel.